and dive right into some questions. So how did you first become interested in the issue of federal debt and the period that you covered in your remarks today?
Federal debt is rising and has been a headline issue in recent months and years, so it's hard to ignore. I've been trained as an economist and an expert in finance, and federal debt is front and center among all of the current concerns that people would worry about in finance and economics.
Mm-hmm.
I began a focus on the Panic of 1907, thinking about why it is that markets periodically go out of whack and experience these convulsions.
Mm-hmm.
There was a great deal of research in the 1990s on behavioral aspects of finance, herding-like movements among investors, biases that appear to affect the rational judgment of investors, et cetera. And so I decided to look at an event, a very prominent event in which such biases occurred. The Panic of 1907 is a great example. Of course, I published a book on the Panic of 1907 just before the crisis of 2008, where we lived through another example of that. In fact, the book was instructive to people who are trying to understand what was happening in 2008. But during a panic, you see all of the worst attributes of market behavior emerge.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So, in your most recent panel, what do you think the most important point was that you would want the audience, especially the young senators, the Coolidge senators, to remember as the future generation is on the rise and we're currently facing this crisis together? So what do you want them to remember if they could take one lesson away?
I think the crises we reviewed in this panel discussion point to the fact that markets periodically go out of whack, that the crises produce dramatic changes in public policy, and therefore, as one lives through a crisis, it's worthwhile to reflect on what needs to be changed, what needs to be improved. And so often it's a matter of old ideas that have served their purpose, but that actually fed the conditions that created the new crisis. And therefore, it's important to reform and renew and reconstruct public policies to adapt to the evidence that the new crisis presents.
So what do you think the most misunderstood thing about the period that you spoke about would be?
The role of J.P. Morgan in quelling the crisis of 1907 has been regarded popularly as an exemplar of a rich individual exploiting market conditions for his own benefit or for the benefit of a few people. This became the focus of a major congressional investigation in 1911, 1912 called the Money Trust hearings, convened by Congressman Arsène Pujol. In fact, the hearings did establish that J.P. Morgan and the firm J.P. Morgan and a couple of other firms had significant representations on boards of directors of industrial companies. But it did not prove that these positions of representation had been exploited for the benefit of those financial firms. In point of fact, the analysis of economic history shows that the presence of a well-developed financial system, financial community, financial institutions, financial markets is vitally important for the economic development and well-being of a country. What was happening in the 1890s and early 1900s was a dramatic transition into the modern form of a financial system, and therefore I think of the the hearings in Congress that followed the Panic of 1907 as a bit belated protest, and perhaps as a manifestation of anxiety about the financial revolution that was underway. In long retrospect, I think we'd say the financial revolution was a good thing, that it served the interests of economic growth and development and well-being, and that the role that J.P. Morgan played in quelling the crisis was also meritorious. It could well be that he made money, it could well be that others did too, but by lending money and charging interest, that's what banks do as a matter of living. And by the way, that's how they get compensated for the risks they take. And truly, interest rates are a means of sending signals to actors throughout the economy about where to allocate resources, and that's a very important and good thing. So I look at the charges against J.P. Morgan and say, well, he was doing what virtually any private lender would have done. He served an admirable purpose. He mobilized collective action and quelled the crisis.
That's extremely fascinating. And that kind of leads me to my next question. We've been talking a lot about Coolidge's role and his economic policy of his administration and balancing the budgets. And there's one person that I'm particularly interested in hearing your thoughts about, and the role that he played within the Coolidge administration, which is Andrew Mellon. How vital of a key player do you think that he was in sort of establishing Coolidge's initial principles on how to deal with national debt?
Andrew Mellon was vitally important as a manifestation not only of Coolidge's principles, but of the Republican Party orthodoxy that had more or less ruled the country since the Civil War. That orthodoxy was oriented toward sound money, the hard money, the dollar sustaining its purchasing power and its historical rate of convertibility into gold or into British pounds. The belief in paying debts, in maintaining the credit worthiness of the nation, a belief in balancing the budget, in low to moderate taxes on the populace. It was a belief in some extent in favor of protectionism and against free trade, but so like many of his predecessors since the Civil War, he had carried those sentiments into office, and I think was an effective and very articulate spokesperson for those values. That said, he was pursued relentlessly after the end of the Hoover administration. He was charged with tax evasion by the federal government. He was subjected to an extraordinarily long legal claim against him. The claim was ultimately settled to the satisfaction of him and the Internal Revenue Service. It is I think the evidence is strong that he did not violate the laws. I think it was more of a question of the interpretation of the existing acts and what an individual could do. But he to his credit, helped to stabilize the finances of the country after World War I, and frankly preserved the credit worthiness of the country such that when the Great Depression came, the country could borrow very substantially.
Thank you. Do you believe that President Calvin Coolidge's budget and debt legacy is still relevant today?
Oh, it's hugely relevant, and it's a reminder that we have balanced the budget in the past. It has doing so has had very positive impact on the economy and society of the country. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a worthy reminder that there's an alternate way, mm-hmm. and we shouldn't forget it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bruner, for the opportunity to interview you today.